So today we are going to be talking about why a compelling beginning matters and how you can write one. So your first impression really matters in life and in writing. People do have short attention spans these days. And so if you want a reader to stick with you, then you have to earn their attention. You have to write something that really grabs them. But unlike in life, though, you don't really need the first part of your story to match up with everything that you're going to tell later on, in the way that you want your first impression to be a good representation of yourself, right? In fact, it can be way more interesting to let the reader think that something totally different is going to happen. So say if your story is maybe about somebody who ends up going to the hospital for an illness, you can maybe begin with a scene of them winning an award. Just something different to then shift the tone later on and then make the story more interesting as it progresses. So, to think about the first start of your story, then you also want to think about that very first line. It's super important. You want to come up with something snappy and enticing, something that really grabs the reader's attention and makes them want to keep going. There are a lot of really great famous lines in stories throughout history. So you can maybe make a broad statement about society. You can say something like, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. That was Leo Tolstoy in Anna Karenina, a very famous opening line. Or you can maybe start with something a little more action-packed. So many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. That was Gabriel Garcia Marquez writing in 100 Years of Solitude, another famous opening line. Those sort of opening lines are going to be reflective of the story that you want to tell. So maybe if you want to write something that's a little bit more of a social commentary, you're going to want to start with something a little bit like that first example, something that makes a broader statement about everything that's going on in the world. Or if you're starting with something that's a little bit more action or maybe a romance or science fiction, you want to just get right to the point and you want something that's a little bit more like the second line. But whatever your first line is, it should motivate you to keep writing. If you're having fun with it, then the reader will probably have fun reading it as well. So let's jump into a student example. So this student was tasked with writing a short piece about a character reflecting on their past using a lot of descriptive language. And this is what she wrote. In the midst of the peaceful Tang dynasty, where the sounds of the pipa filled the air and the scent of plum blossoms danced on the breeze, there lived a young girl named Li Mei. She was a dreamer, always lost in her thoughts, imagining vibrant colors and whispering her aspirations. As she sat beneath the blooming plum tree in her family's courtyard, Li Mei let her mind wander back to a moment that had changed her life forever. So I want you to think a little bit about that beginning and think specifically about how you describe this beginning. Words like dreamy, poetic, peaceful, light come to mind. She seems gentle. She seems like a romantic. Now I want you to read your own work and think about how you'd characterize the tone of it specifically. Does it really make sense with the rest of your story? Is it aligned with everything else? Do the elements that are introduced just really add up to everything else you're going to say? Because I said at the beginning that you don't necessarily want the opening scene to have everything to do with the rest of your story. It can be maybe a little bit off focus, but you do want the tone to be consistent. You always want to sound like yourself. You don't want things to come in that just don't make sense. And so this is a good example of a tone that's going to stay consistent throughout the rest of her work. It was an opening scene that really did seem to flow into everything else that she was writing and saying. To analyze our example further, let's go into the good about the story, right? There's a really great sense of setting, and we understand who Li Mei is. In the first paragraph, we have the descriptive evocative language that I was asking for. The scent of plum blossoms danced on the breeze, whispering her aspirations. Those are great lines that show style, that show a specific voice, and that style stays consistent throughout the rest of the story. If we want to think about what needs work, we can think about the lines, there lived a young girl and let her mind wander. Those are a little bit cliched. We tend to hear those things in writing a lot, but that story is mostly about an inner journey. And so it's meant to explore the use of poetic language as well, And so it's not a huge deal if your writing contains some phrases that are maybe a little bit common. But if you want to come up with a very original voice, then you want to avoid certain phrasings, right? And you do want to be critical in looking at your own writing and trying to eliminate the things that maybe sound like other people. So, to go into general advice about writing a compelling beginning, you really want to figure out who your characters are to begin with. You want to plan ahead. You can plan ahead and think about their traits, their characters, their personalities before you begin. What do they like? What do they dislike? What's their family background? Those are all questions that you should be asking of your characters before you begin the story. Then you can also think about what they do in the first scene that will then maybe interest a reader. What is something that they like to do? What is something that they probably would do based on the plan that you've created for them and the type of character that you're trying to make them out to be, right? Then you think about how will they act? How do they usually behave? You should also try to make them act in a way that people will understand. People want to see themselves in fiction, right? So they should be relatable to the average reader. That will maybe make them more sucked into the story if they can see themselves in what you're writing. For more general advice, I want you to focus on the particular scene that you're writing in the beginning. Once again, I'm asking you to plan ahead. It's very important to come into a story with some specific ideas of what you want to do. So you should have a plan about how long your story should be. That will help you to figure out how long the beginning should be. So I only showed you the first paragraph of that student example because the story itself was pretty short. It was only about 2 pages. So the first paragraph is really all that the beginning needed to be. That was a length that corresponded to the length of the rest of the story. But if you're writing, say, a 10 to 15 page story, then you're going to want your opening scene to be a little bit longer. It's just about proportion. You should also try to make the scene as contained as possible. It should maybe be able to stand on its own as its own story, especially if you're writing a story that's much longer. What I would advise you not to do is don't just write something that has nothing to do with the character's or the story's overall arc or the character's overall arc. You shouldn't see a character maybe doing something that's never mentioned again or write about a conflict that isn't at all relevant to the plot or characters. As I mentioned in the beginning, you can write a scene that maybe doesn't have everything to do with the rest of the story, but the characters and the setting should all match up with then what you're going to say. So you shouldn't introduce any random elements that are never going to appear again. You should have it flow into each other in a very natural way. And thinking about the setting and the dialogue, you want to reveal as much about the setting as you need to set up the story and the rest of the action, but you shouldn't necessarily give everything away. You want to leave the reader a little bit of mystery and a little bit of room to grow, right, as the story continues. So establish some sense of the characters' relationships and their environment and their activities and what they like to do, but maybe don't go into everything about how they specifically feel. That type of interiority, that type of thinking and inner monologue, that's going to be more interesting as the story progresses. You want to introduce them, but you don't necessarily want to reveal every single thing about them. And that way, in thinking about dialogue, you can have some dialogue, but maybe don't include too much. Exposition is important, so that balance of dialogue and exposition will help you to establish how your character speaks and interacts with the world. So in thinking about the ending of the story, I've obviously talked about planning ahead, and planning ahead is really what's going to help you make the most inroads when you're just editing. Because if you came in with a structured idea of how you want to set the story up, then you're probably not going to have to do as much revising in the end. So plot out the story before you begin, at least a little bit. And then when it comes to editing, it is very important to reread your work and then edit and make revisions. It also can be very helpful to get external feedback if you can. So call in a friend, call in a teacher, call in someone whose feedback you trust, just to see if they would be interested in reading the story. And especially if we're talking about beginning, have them just read the beginning and then ask them, are you interested in continuing to read the story? I would also advise you not to make it too long. Sometimes shorter is better. Sometimes just a little bit is all you need. And sometimes people just want a tiny morsel to continue on with the rest of the meal, so to speak. So with all of that being said, you're now ready to go ahead and start writing. You can think about all of this beginning stuff, and you can think about all of that you want to create in the beginning. This is all general advice, right? But you should also try to enjoy yourself in this writing. It should be a creative exercise. It should be something that you have a little bit of fun with. And when you're having fun, your reader will probably have fun too.